"You shouldn't have come here alone," a low voice whispered through the rain-soaked alley, and I froze mid-step, my hand clutching the strap of my worn leather backpack like it could anchor me to safety. The night air was thick with the scent of wet asphalt and distant exhaust, and each footfall echoed harshly against the brick walls, bouncing back at me in irregular rhythms that made my pulse quicken. I forced myself to keep moving, glancing over my shoulder at the shadowy figure that emerged from the darkness like a predator stepping out of the black. Derek Blackwood was taller than I expected, his presence commanding the narrow space, the hem of his tailored coat brushing the puddles without a hint of concern for the water splashing onto his polished shoes. His eyes, sharp and calculating, seemed to measure every inch of me, and the faint glow of a street lamp caught the edge of his jaw, sharp as a knife itself. My heart beat faster, hammering in my chest, each thump loud enough that I could almost hear it over the soft patter of rain hitting the ground. I tried to swallow, but my throat had gone dry, the words lodged somewhere between my lips and the icy tension in the air. I took another cautious step, feeling the wet concrete shift beneath my shoes, and the sound of my own breath seemed amplified in the narrow alleyway. Derek's gaze didn't waver. It followed me, unblinking, as if calculating how long it would take before fear overtook my control. I could feel the weight of his presence pressing down on me, the aura of authority he carried so effortlessly, and instinctively, my hand brushed against the pocket of my jacket, where I kept the small knife tucked safely but within reach. My mind raced, thinking of all the times I'd been warned about men like him, stories that blurred the line between caution and panic, but also that small, stubborn voice that told me I didn't have to run. I shifted my weight, letting my back brush against the cold brick, listening to the distant hum of traffic that seemed both comforting and impossibly far away. Derek took a slow step forward, and I could see the way the rain slicked off his dark hair, catching the occasional glint of streetlight, his expression unreadable but undeniably intense. Every instinct screamed at me to bolt, but something in the way he moved, deliberate and measured, gave me pause, made me realize that fear alone wouldn't dictate the night. I clenched my jaw, feeling the small knife pressing lightly against my palm, the metal cool and steady, a reminder that I had a choice, that I wasn't completely powerless. The air between us thickened with unspoken tension, every second stretching longer than the last, the rain drumming a steady percussion against the metal dumpster nearby. My eyes never left his, tracing the contours of his face, trying to anticipate the slightest twitch, the smallest shift in his posture, but Derek remained calm, unyielding, a perfect balance of threat and restraint. I inhaled sharply, letting the damp, cool air fill my lungs, and for a brief moment, the chaos of my racing thoughts stilled as I realized that the next move would define everything. Whether I remained trapped in this alley under his watchful gaze, or finally reclaimed a fraction of control over the night that had seemed determined to swallow me whole. The rain continued to fall in steady sheets, slicking the alley in dark reflections that flickered with each passing streetlight, and I could feel the cool moisture seep through my jacket, sticking to my skin in a way that made every movement deliberate and cautious. My hand remained near the small knife in my pocket, a silent assurance that I had some measure of control even if the situation felt overwhelming. Derek did not move closer immediately. Instead, he shifted slightly, the soles of his polished shoes scraping faintly against the wet concrete, measuring the space between us as if testing the boundaries of this confrontation. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, and I forced myself to slow it, inhaling through my nose and letting the damp air fill my lungs, counting each heartbeat like a metronome to steady my nerves. The alley was narrow, flanked by brick walls that seemed to close in with the shadows, and every dripping gutter and distant horn made me hyper-aware of my surroundings, heightening the tension that vibrated between us. Derek finally spoke again, his voice low but carrying effortlessly in the empty space. "You do not understand the consequences of your actions," and I felt the weight of his words like a tangible pressure on my shoulders, compelling me to consider my next move carefully. I took a deliberate step to the side, the wet surface causing my boot to slip slightly, and I held my balance, refusing to let a small misstep betray the tremor in my body. My mind raced through possibilities, imagining every way this encounter could escalate, but I focused on what I could control: my stance, my breathing, my attention. Derek tilted his head, observing me with a calculated patience, his dark eyes catching the occasional glint of streetlight and holding it, as if storing the details for later. I allowed myself a brief glance at the exit at the far end of the alley, estimating the distance and calculating how quickly I could reach it if necessary, but I did not move, holding the knife lightly, almost like a prop in this tense tableau. The sound of rain against the metal fire escape above us created a rhythmic backdrop, each drop punctuating the silence between words, each movement deliberate and precise, as if the world had slowed to accommodate this critical moment. I sensed a shift in Derek's posture, a subtle tightening of his shoulders, and for the first time, I understood that my presence, my courage in standing my ground, was registering with him in a way that demanded attention. My eyes never left his, tracking every micro-expression, every twitch of his jaw, and I allowed a flicker of determination to enter my gaze, signaling that I was not just a passive figure in this confrontation. Derek exhaled slowly, a controlled, measured release that seemed to acknowledge my stance without diminishing his own authority, and the tension between us held, taut as a wire stretched to its limits. Each second felt elongated, filled with the unspoken dialogue of two people sizing each other up, and I felt a strange mixture of fear and empowerment, knowing that this moment, suspended in rain and shadow, would define the tone for everything that followed. I shifted slightly again, the knife in my pocket a constant reminder that I had not surrendered, that despite the imbalance of power and the intensity of his presence, I retained agency. The alley seemed to shrink around us, the wet walls reflecting the subtle movement of our figures, the interplay of light and shadow creating a visual echo of the tension in the air. I inhaled deeply, forcing my mind to focus, and felt the first true sense of clarity since this encounter began, that even in the face of someone as imposing as Derek Blackwood, my choices mattered, and that the next few moments would hinge entirely on my ability to remain calm, deliberate, and aware of every nuance in this charged, rain-slicked space. The distant hum of traffic and the rhythmic patter of rain created a backdrop that felt suspended in time as I cautiously shifted my weight, keeping the knife secure in my pocket while my eyes never left Derek Blackwood. Every step he took seemed deliberate, calculated, and yet there was a subtle hesitation in the way he measured the distance between us, as if recognizing that my resolve was not easily shaken. The alley walls, slick with rain, reflected the dim glow of streetlights in fractured patterns that made shadows dance across his face, highlighting the intensity of his dark eyes and the set of his jaw. My pulse continued to race, each beat echoing through my chest as I consciously slowed my breathing, drawing in the damp, cool air to steady my nerves and focus on every micro-movement around me. Derek tilted his head slightly, the faintest arch of an eyebrow signaling recognition, a silent acknowledgement that I was not a typical target, and the subtle shift in his stance made me realize that the balance of this encounter was delicately poised. I felt a surge of determination, the small knife pressing lightly against my fingers as if reminding me that I held a thread of control, that I was not merely subject to the weight of his presence. I stepped a fraction closer to the exit, my boots splashing through small puddles, careful not to betray the tremor in my legs, and I noticed the way Derek's eyes tracked the movement, dark and unblinking, registering every choice I made. The sound of a distant siren cut across the night, briefly layering another texture onto the alley's ambience, and for a moment, the tension between us flickered as we both processed the external noise without distraction. I took a deep breath, feeling the dampness cling to my skin, the cool rain running along my sleeves and dripping onto the cracked concrete, and I allowed a sliver of strategy to enter my thoughts, considering the few options available while maintaining a posture that suggested confidence rather than fear. Derek's lips parted slightly, forming words I could not yet hear, his expression a complex interplay of curiosity and measured caution, and I met his gaze without flinching, letting the weight of my unwavering focus communicate that I would not be intimidated. The space between us seemed charged, each second stretching as the alley held its breath, the wet walls reflecting the tense tableau, shadows twisting and elongating, creating a visual echo of the silent standoff. I adjusted my grip slightly on the knife, feeling the cool metal against my palm, and the awareness of its presence anchored me in the moment, reinforcing the quiet assertion that I had not surrendered to the fear that pressed against me. Derek moved subtly, shifting his weight, the movement smooth, practiced, yet it carried a trace of respect, an acknowledgement that he had encountered resistance unexpected in someone so seemingly ordinary. I inhaled deeply, the wet air filling my lungs, and for the first time in the encounter, I sensed the delicate balance tilting, the moment suspended, pregnant with the possibility that this night would not conclude as he might have anticipated, that the control he sought to assert could be met with equal determination and an unspoken courage that neither of us had anticipated. The night air grew heavier with each step, the rain falling in a steady rhythm that coated the alley in reflective silver, and I felt every droplet tracing cold lines along my jacket sleeves as I subtly shifted my stance, maintaining both balance and composure. Derek Blackwood remained still for a heartbeat longer than I expected. His dark eyes locked on mine, measuring the determination etched in my posture and the steadiness in my grip. His lips pressed together in quiet contemplation. I allowed myself a small, controlled exhale, feeling the tension coiling and uncoiling in my chest, aware that the slightest movement could tilt the delicate equilibrium we had established. The distant wail of a siren punctuated the alley, a stark reminder of the city alive around us. Yet the space between us seemed insulated, as if the world beyond the rain had paused to watch the silent standoff unfold. I adjusted my feet slightly, toes brushing the wet concrete, and the knife in my pocket pressed against my fingers in a reassuring reminder that I had a tangible connection to my own agency, a subtle but firm assertion that I was not entirely at the mercy of Derek's imposing presence. Derek's gaze followed my subtle movements with a precision that was almost unnerving, his head tilting just enough to catch the glint of the knife as I shifted, a flash that spoke of recognition rather than surprise. My heart rate ticked upward as I registered the acknowledgement, a small victory that strengthened my resolve, and I felt the pulse of the rain in time with my own, a steady rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the heightened awareness coursing through my body. Every sound, the distant honk of a car, the drip from a leaky gutter, the subtle squish of my boots on the soaked pavement, became amplified, each one a signal to remain alert, to maintain control over every gesture, every breath, every decision. Derek exhaled slowly, the action deliberate, controlled, a subtle concession that he recognized the challenge I presented, and the shift in his stance carried weight, a quiet signal that he would proceed with caution. I took a measured step toward the faint glow of the streetlight at the alley's mouth, calculating distance, estimating time, weighing options, yet refusing to make a move that would betray the careful balance we had achieved. The reflection of the light on the wet bricks cast fractured shapes that danced across his face, emphasizing the sharp planes of his features and the intensity in his eyes. And I allowed myself to notice without distraction, letting the visual detail anchor me in the moment while keeping my attention fully on the dynamics between us. My breathing steadied further, a conscious effort to maintain calm, and I felt the steadying presence of the knife, not as a weapon but as a symbol of the control I retained in the situation, a silent declaration that I would not be hurried or coerced. Derek shifted again, a subtle, measured motion that suggested both assessment and respect, his dark eyes scanning every nuance of my stance, and I met his gaze without flinching, maintaining the silent dialogue that had grown between us, each acknowledging the other's strength and the unspoken rules now governing our encounter. The alley seemed to shrink around us, wet walls reflecting light and shadow, enclosing us in a space that was both confining and clarifying, sharpening every perception and heightening the stakes. The rain drumming a rhythmic reminder that time was passing and that the choices I made in the next moments would define the trajectory of this encounter, a moment poised on the edge of uncertainty and quiet power. The alley seemed to stretch endlessly, the rain creating a sheen that mirrored the tension coiling between us as I shifted my weight carefully, feeling the cold, wet pavement under my boots and the knife still secure in my pocket. Derek Blackwood's eyes followed each subtle motion, dark and unwavering, but there was a faint recognition in their depth, an acknowledgement that I was not merely reacting out of fear. I inhaled deeply, letting the damp night air fill my lungs, counting each heartbeat in a deliberate rhythm to steady the rising panic that threatened to betray me. The faint splash of water from a gutter, the distant honk of a horn, and the soft scuff of boots against concrete became amplified, each sound guiding my focus and sharpening my awareness of the alley's dimensions, the positioning of walls, and the exits that might allow me space if needed. I shifted slightly to the side, careful not to make sudden movements that could be misinterpreted, and Derek adjusted in response, a subtle tilt of his head, a shift in weight that suggested careful observation rather than immediate action. My fingers brushed the small knife again, its presence a tangible reminder of the control I retained, and I felt the first spark of confidence, a quiet assurance that I could influence the flow of the encounter. The rain continued to fall steadily, each droplet tapping against my jacket and mixing with the slick concrete reflections to create fractured patterns of light and shadow that played across Derek's face, highlighting the sharp planes of his jaw and the measured intensity of his gaze. I exhaled slowly, forcing a steady rhythm into my breathing, the damp chill against my skin reminding me to remain alert, aware, and deliberate with each choice. Derek's eyes followed the movement of my chest as I inhaled, noting the rise and fall, and I felt the silent exchange of understanding that no words could convey, the unspoken acknowledgement of mutual recognition that had developed over these tense minutes. I allowed my shoulders to relax fractionally, letting the knife rest lightly against my palm, a symbolic connection to the assertion I had maintained through the standoff. Each second stretched, heavy with anticipation, the silence punctuated only by the rain and our shared focus, the alley narrowing our world to this single, charged moment. I felt the faint pressure of adrenaline, a sharpened awareness of spatial dynamics, every shift in Derek's posture, every subtle glance registering in my mind, informing my next decision. A distant car passed, tires hissing against puddles, and the alley seemed to respond with an echo that reinforced the isolation of our encounter, a private stage for a silent negotiation of power, caution, and measured confidence. I moved a step closer to the streetlight at the far end, not out of submission, but to signal readiness, to assert presence without provocation, and Derek adjusted without breaking his calm, the tension holding, taut, charged, but balanced. The wet walls reflected our forms, distorted but precise, capturing the silent dialogue of stance, gaze, and posture, the interplay of authority and control, the nuanced recognition that had formed, subtle, yet undeniable. I felt the night press in, rain dripping steadily, the sounds of the city distant but persistent, each beat of my heart echoing the delicate balance, a rhythm of vigilance, awareness, and quiet assertion that defined this moment, holding us poised at the edge of uncertainty where the choices made would determine the direction of everything that followed. The rain had eased into a steady drizzle, leaving the alley slick and glistening, reflecting the dim amber of the streetlights that stretched like halos across the wet concrete. I shifted my weight subtly, feeling the knife in my pocket a quiet reassurance of the control I still possessed, a silent promise to myself that I would not yield to the pressure of Derek Blackwood's presence. His dark eyes tracked me constantly, unblinking, the intensity in their depths both intimidating and oddly measured, as if he were carefully considering every nuance of my stance, every tremor in my movements, every flicker of hesitation that might betray fear. I inhaled, letting the cool, damp air fill my lungs fully, and then exhaled slowly, forcing a rhythm into my heartbeat that countered the rapid pulse threatening to take over. The alley walls, slick with rain, seemed to close in around us, enclosing us in a space where the tension felt almost tangible, vibrating in the air between us, charged and unyielding. I stepped lightly to adjust my position, mindful of the puddles and uneven concrete, and felt the subtle pressure of the knife against my fingers, a constant reminder of the agency I held in this standoff. Derek moved with slow deliberation, the faint scrape of his polished shoes against the wet ground a precise accompaniment to his unspoken assessment, and I noted the way his posture shifted, shoulders slightly forward, head tilting as he absorbed the signal of my readiness and resolve. Each second stretched, elongated by the intensity of focus, the rain pattering in unrelenting rhythm, droplets striking the brick walls and pooling along the edges of the alley in miniature rivers of light and shadow. I felt a flicker of determination, the quiet assertion of presence that had begun to grow within me. And I let it steady my movements, keeping my gaze locked on Derek's face, reading every subtle cue as he measured me, gauged my intentions, and calculated his response. The distant sound of a passing car, tires hissing on wet asphalt, served as a reminder that the city continued around us. Yet within this narrow corridor of rain and shadow, time seemed slowed, compressed, focused entirely on the exchange of awareness and control. I shifted another step, careful and deliberate, letting the knife slide slightly in my pocket to maintain the reassuring contact, and I sensed Derek's acknowledgement in the subtle tension of his posture, a recognition that this encounter was no longer one-sided, that the balance of power had shifted in a small but significant way. The reflections on the wet brick walls fractured and elongated our forms, casting a play of light that mirrored the complex dynamics unfolding between us. Every gesture amplified, every glance meaningful, every breath a part of the silent dialogue. I exhaled again, deeper this time, feeling the wet chill on my skin, the rhythm of the rain, the pulse of my own focus, and I understood with clarity that the standoff had reached a point of equilibrium, fragile but present, a space in which careful observation, steady presence, and quiet confidence would guide the next moments, defining how this encounter would unfold as the alley held its breath in anticipation. The alley seemed to contract and expand with every heartbeat, the wet bricks reflecting fractured light that danced across Derek Blackwood's sharp features and the tense set of my own jaw. I felt the knife in my pocket, a subtle weight, a reminder of my presence and my choice, a silent declaration that I was not merely reacting but actively shaping the moment. Derek's eyes tracked my every shift, unblinking and intense, and I met his gaze without wavering, letting the determination I carried communicate itself in the tilt of my head, the squared shoulders, and the deliberate, measured movements of my feet. The rain, lighter now, fell in thin streams, threading through my hair and dripping onto my jacket, each droplet a tactile punctuation to the rhythm of anticipation that filled the space. I allowed a controlled breath to fill my lungs, feeling the damp coolness and steadying the quick rise and fall of my chest, channeling the tension into a deliberate calm that Derek seemed to notice, his posture adjusting in response, subtle but undeniable. The reflections on the puddles mirrored the complexity of the standoff, light and shadow intertwining across his form and mind, creating an almost cinematic canvas of two figures locked in silent negotiation. I stepped lightly, adjusting to the contours of the slick pavement, and felt the knife shift in my pocket, grounding me further in the knowledge that I maintained agency, that this encounter had evolved into a careful balance between presence and control. Derek's gaze softened fractionally, an acknowledgement that he recognized my resolve, but there was still the undercurrent of authority in the set of his shoulders and the intensity of his eyes, a reminder that power had shifted only subtly, yet meaningfully. The distant sound of a car passing on the street beyond echoed faintly, highlighting the isolation of our alley, and I noted the micro-movements in his expression, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the almost imperceptible lift of a brow, subtle cues that spoke volumes in the quiet tension. I inhaled again, letting the cool air fill my lungs completely, and as I exhaled, I felt a surge of clarity, the awareness of every sound, every reflection, every subtle shift in space between us sharpening my senses and reinforcing the quiet assertion that I would not be overwhelmed. Derek moved a fraction, recalculating, and I mirrored him with a careful step, neither advancing nor retreating, maintaining the fragile equilibrium we had achieved, the silent exchange of observation and acknowledgement stretching each second into deliberate contemplation. My focus sharpened, registering the texture of wet brick beneath my fingers as I adjusted slightly against the wall, the rhythm of dripping water accentuating the pace of my thoughts and the weight of this tense moment. The alley held us in a cocoon of damp air, shadow, and reflection, a space that seemed suspended in time, where every gesture, every inhale, Every subtle movement conveyed unspoken negotiation. I felt the knife in my pocket again, a grounding point, a symbol of my assertion and control, and as Derek shifted once more, the tension in his posture hinted at recognition of my quiet strength, an understanding that our interaction had reached a point where anticipation, respect, and cautious observation coexisted, each of us aware of the stakes and the delicate balance that would determine the next unfolding moments of the night. The drizzle had thinned into a soft mist, leaving the alley shimmering with faint reflections of amber and silver from the distant streetlights, and I felt a quiet clarity settle over me, each breath deliberate, each movement measured. Derek Blackwood's presence remained formidable, yet there was a subtle shift in the tension, a silent recognition in his posture that suggested the standoff was evolving, the balance no longer strictly in his favor. I took a careful step forward, boots splashing lightly in a small puddle, the knife in my pocket pressing gently against my fingers, reminding me that I retained agency, that the moment could be guided by precision and awareness rather than fear. Derek's gaze followed without interruption, dark eyes attentive, registering every nuance of my stance, every flicker of intent, and I met his look steadily, letting the determination in my posture convey that I was neither retreating nor yielding. The alley seemed suspended in time, the soft rhythm of falling droplets creating a steady percussion that underscored the intensity of our silent dialogue, the walls reflecting light and shadow in fractured patterns that highlighted the contours of his face and the resolve in mine. I inhaled slowly, letting the cool dampness fill my lungs, and exhaled deliberately, grounding myself in the sensory details of the night. The slick concrete underfoot, the faint smell of rain mingled with asphalt, the distant hum of traffic providing context, yet remaining separate from the immediacy of our confrontation. A small shift in Derek's stance, a barely perceptible adjustment of his shoulders, indicated attention and calculation, and I responded by slightly adjusting my weight, maintaining the equilibrium, neither inviting further aggression nor conceding authority. The knife in my pocket was a constant, subtle presence, a reassurance of choice and a tactile signal that I was not passive, that I could influence the flow of the encounter through poise, observation, and strategic stillness. Each second stretched as we continued the silent exchange, reflections of light and shadow flickering across wet walls, the interplay of tension and anticipation marking every heartbeat, heightening focus and sharpening perception. I allowed my senses to absorb every detail, the damp air, the sound of water dripping from gutters, the micro-movements of Derek's hands, his gaze tracing mine, registering patience, recognition, and perhaps a dawning respect. I moved another fraction, the knife shifting lightly, a grounding connection, and I could sense the balance shifting incrementally, a subtle affirmation that the dynamics had changed, that my calm, deliberate assertion had earned space within the tension, creating a fragile but undeniable equilibrium. The alley's confines emphasized the concentration, amplifying the silent negotiation between presence, posture, and perception, and I felt a rare clarity, an awareness that in this shared, rain-washed space, every breath, glance, and measured step carried weight, defining the next turn of events and establishing the moment as one of poised control and quiet vigilance, a point from which the remainder of the night could unfold under the terms quietly set by observation, precision, and silent assertion. The alley seemed to exhale with the finality of the night, the rain now a fine mist that left the wet concrete shimmering beneath the dim glow of distant streetlights, and I felt the tension ease slightly, not gone, but transformed into a cautious acknowledgement of space and mutual observation. Derek Blackwood remained across from me, the shadows playing across his face in fractured patterns, highlighting the angles of his jaw and the sharp focus in his dark eyes, and I met his gaze without flinching, feeling the quiet satisfaction of standing my ground. My fingers brushed the knife lightly, a subtle reassurance, a reminder that the encounter had been guided by awareness and deliberate choices rather than uncertainty or fear, and I let that feeling anchor me as I adjusted my stance just enough to step toward the faint exit at the end of the alley. Derek shifted with me, the movement almost imperceptible, a measured acknowledgement that the balance had changed, that the authority he carried had met a presence unwilling to be overshadowed. The damp air carried the scent of wet brick and faint asphalt, and the distant sounds of the city. A car passing, tires hissing over puddles, faint hum of neon, reminded me that the world continued beyond our secluded corridor, yet in this enclosed space. Time had slowed, each heartbeat and breath stretched into deliberate consideration. I exhaled slowly, feeling the moisture on my skin and the rhythm of my pulse, and with each measured step, I realized the subtle power of perception, of posture, and of presence, the silent communication between us articulated without words but fully understood. Derek's eyes lingered on my form, tracing the lines of tension and relaxation, noting the steadiness that had developed, and I recognized in that look a complexity, a recognition that our interaction had created a moment of suspended balance, neither dominated by fear nor by unilateral authority. The reflections on the puddles cast elongating images of us across the alley, each ripple and shimmer amplifying the silent dialogue of movement, gaze, and intention, and I allowed my attention to encompass every detail, every nuance, every ambient sound as a way of reinforcing presence and control. I shifted slightly again, careful, deliberate, the knife in my pocket a tactile reminder of my capacity to act if necessary, a symbol of agency and awareness that had grown through the night, and Derek responded with a subtle adjustment of posture, a tilt of the head, a micro-expression that acknowledged the careful equilibrium now governing the moment. The alley felt contained, the wet walls reflecting light, shadow, and tension in a complex interplay that mirrored the silent negotiation between two figures fully aware of each other's strengths, presence, and limits, and I sensed that the choice to remain deliberate and measured had transformed the confrontation into a space of mutual respect, anticipation, and unspoken understanding. Each breath, each micro-movement, each subtle glance had contributed to a new rhythm, a cadence of observation and restraint, and as I moved toward the faint light marking the alley's end, I felt the culmination of the night's encounter, a quiet resolution born of focus, awareness, and deliberate assertion, leaving the alley charged with the echo of tension that had been held, balanced, and finally acknowledged.